My name is Marielle Grace. I was 28 when everything changed, when the sound of a hospital monitor became the only thing standing between me and losing my mind. The waiting room smelled like burnt coffee and antiseptic, a combination I would never be able to forget for the rest of my life. I sat with my hands pressed together so tightly my knuckles had gone white, watching the clock above the nurse's station tick forward in increments that felt cruel in their slowness. My daughter, Lily, was 4 years old. She was somewhere behind those double doors with her chest open, her small heart being repaired by hands steadier than mine could ever be. I kept replaying the cardiologist's voice from 3 weeks earlier. Asterisk, a congenital defect. Treatable, but the surgery is complex. Asterisk, I had nodded along in that appointment like a woman who understood, when really I was drowning quietly behind a calm face, the way I'd learned to drown quietly behind a calm face my whole life. My phone buzzed in my lap. I looked down, hoping, foolishly, desperately, that it was my mother. That she'd found a way to leave work, to get on a flight, to sit beside me the way mothers were supposed to when their grandchildren were dying on an operating table 3 floors above a waiting room full of strangers. It was her. Finally. I opened the message with a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. She's not our problem, Marielle. You chose to have her. Don't call again during business hours. I read it twice, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something survivable. Around me, other families held each other. A father paced with a toddler on his hip. An elderly woman gripped her husband's hand like it was the last solid thing in the world. And I sat alone, holding a phone with 5 words on it that undid something in me I hadn't known was still capable of being undone. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect tears in moments like this, and I didn't have any. What I had instead was a stillness, a terrible, clarifying stillness, like standing at the edge of a frozen lake and hearing the first crack beneath your feet. I put the phone face down on my knee. I looked back at the doors. Somewhere behind them, a surgeon was holding my daughter's heart in his hands with more care than my own mother had ever held mine. I grew up in a house with good lighting and bad silences. My mother, Renata, was the kind of woman people admired from a distance, composed, articulate, the sort of guest who brought the good wine and left before the dishes needed doing. She had 2 daughters. My older sister, Camille, was the one who mattered. I understood this early, the way children understand things without anyone saying them directly, through the seating arrangement at dinner, through whose report card got taped to the refrigerator, through whose name was said first in every sentence that began with the girls. I don't say this with bitterness anymore. I say it the way you describe a house you no longer live in, factually from memory, the ache long since folded into something quieter. When I got pregnant at 24 unmarried, the father gone before Lily was even a rumor in my body, my mother's reaction had been swift and clean, like a door closing on a draft. You've embarrassed this family, Camille, married by then to a man our mother approved of, had simply gone quiet on the subject, the way she went quiet on anything that might cost her something. I raised Lily alone. I worked 2 jobs for the first year, then one good one once I finished my certification in medical billing, a career I'd chosen specifically because the hours let me be home by 5. I built a small, steady life. An apartment with 2 thin walls, but a landlord who fixed things when they broke. A daughter who laughed with her whole body, who called broccoli tiny trees, and insisted on wearing rain boots even in July. I didn't need my mother's help. I want that understood. What I needed in that waiting room was not money or logistics. I needed someone who shared my blood to care whether my child lived. I thought of the last family dinner I'd attended 8 months earlier. Lily had drawn a picture of our family, 3 stick figures holding hands under a yellow sun, and given it to my mother as a gift. My mother had thanked her politely, the way you thank a stranger's child, and left the drawing on the counter when she left. I'd found it in the recycling 2 days later, slightly damp from a coffee ring. I hadn't said anything then. I was learning, slowly, that some truths take a long time to become undeniable. The surgery took 6 hours and 11 minutes. I know this because I counted every one of them, sitting in that same chair, my phone now silenced and turned face down for good. When Dr. Okafor finally came through the doors, still in scrubs, his mask pulled down around his neck, I stood so fast the room tilted. He was smiling, a tired, genuine smile, and I felt my legs nearly give out beneath the relief of it. "She did wonderfully," he said. "Her heart is strong. She's going to recover well." I don't remember thanking him properly. I remember pressing my hand over my mouth and nodding, over and over, until a nurse gently guided me to a chair and brought me water I didn't drink. Later, when they let me see her, small and pale against white sheets, tubes taped along her arm, a bandage over the place where they'd opened her chest to fix what her body couldn't fix on its own, I sat beside her bed and simply watched her breathe.
In, out.
The monitor beside her tracing a steady green rhythm that felt, in that moment, like the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I thought about my mother's text. "She's not our problem." I thought about how strange it was that a stranger in scrubs had spent 6 hours protecting the life of a child my own mother had dismissed with 11 words typed between meetings. I didn't reply to the text. Not that day, not the next. I found that the silence I offered back felt less like avoidance and more like the first boundary I had ever successfully built. My sister Camille called on the third day. I almost didn't answer. "Mom told me what happened," she said, her voice careful, testing the ground. The text. She didn't mean it the way it sounded. "She meant it exactly the way it sounded, Cam," I said. That's what made it clear. There was a long pause on the line, the kind of pause that used to make me rush to fill it, to smooth things over, to protect everyone's comfort but my own. I didn't fill it this time. I let it sit there, between us, until Camille finally said, quietly, "I know." 2 words. It wasn't an apology, but it was the first honest thing anyone in my family had said to me in years. Lily came home 12 days later, her scar a thin pink line she liked to show off to anyone who'd look, calling it her zipper. She was proud of it in the way only a child can be proud of a thing that once terrified the adults around her. I took 2 weeks off work to care for her, and in that strange, suspended time, the 2 of us alone in our small apartment, sunlight moving slowly across the same 4 walls each day, I found myself thinking often of the house I'd grown up in. Good lighting. The bad silences. The refrigerator door that only ever held Camille's achievements. I thought about forgiveness, and whether I owed it to anyone, and whether wanting it for myself was different from being expected to give it to someone else. My mother texted twice more that month. Neither message mentioned Lily's surgery, her recovery, or the words she'd sent that day in the waiting room. One was about a family gathering for my father's birthday. The other asked, almost offhandedly, whether I'd be attending. I sat with those messages for a long time before answering either. I thought about the version of myself who would have shown up anyway, who would have arrived with a gift, a smile, an unspoken agreement to never bring up the text, to keep the peace the way I'd always kept it, at my own expense. I was tired of being that version of myself. I wrote back a single sentence. "I'll come when you're ready to ask about your granddaughter's heart, not before." I didn't send it in anger. I sent it the way you set down something heavy you've carried too long, carefully so it doesn't break on the way down. She didn't reply for 11 days. On the 12th day, an envelope arrived. Not a text, not a call, an actual letter, my mother's handwriting on the front, the kind of handwriting I hadn't seen since childhood report cards and thank you notes she'd made me write to relatives. I sat at my kitchen table with it unopened for nearly an hour, Lily napping in the next room, the late afternoon light turning the paper faintly gold. When I finally opened it, the letter was shorter than I expected. My mother was not a woman given long explanations. She wrote that she had been raised by a mother who withheld affection like it was a finite resource, doled out only to the child who earned it. She wrote that she had promised herself she would never repeat that pattern, and then had spent 30 years repeating it anyway, first with me, then, she admitted, almost as an aside, occasionally even with Camille, though differently, more quietly. She wrote that the day of Lily's surgery, she had been afraid, not of the surgery itself, but of what it would mean to sit in that waiting room and feel something she wasn't sure she knew how to feel anymore. So she had done what she always did when fear arrived. She had turned it into distance, into sharpness, into a text sent between meetings instead of a phone call that might have required her to be present. She did not ask for forgiveness in the letter. I noticed that, and I respected it more than I expected to. What she asked, instead, was whether she could meet Lily, really meet her, not as an obligation but as a beginning. I read the letter twice, then folded it and set it on the counter, in the exact spot where I'd once found Lily's drawing damp in the recycling. I didn't answer that day either, but I didn't throw it away. I want to be clear about something. I never wanted revenge in the way people usually mean it. I never wanted my mother to suffer, or to be humiliated, or to feel the particular kind of pain she'd handed me so casually in that waiting room. What I wanted was simpler and, in some ways, harder to achieve. I wanted the truth to exist in the open air between us, instead of being buried under decades of polite silence. I wanted my daughter to grow up in a family where love wasn't rationed based on who had earned it best. So 3 weeks after the letter arrived, I called my mother, not to forgive her outright, and not to punish her with more silence, but to set the terms of whatever came next. "If you want to know, Lily," I said, my voice is steadier than I expected, "it starts with honesty, not performance. Not showing up for photographs and disappearing when things get hard. Real honesty, even when it's uncomfortable." There was a pause, and then, for the first time in my adult life, I heard something in my mother's voice I didn't recognize. Uncertainty. Not composure. Not control. Just a woman, older now than I'd ever really looked at her, trying to find her footing on ground she'd never walked before. "I don't know if I know how to do that," she admitted. "Then we'll find out together," I said, slowly. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet. It was something smaller and more honest than that, an agreement to try, without any guarantee of where trying would lead. My mother came to see Lily on a Sunday afternoon in early autumn, the light doing that particular gold thing it does before the seasons turn. I watched her from the kitchen window as she walked up to the building, and I noticed, for the first time in years, that she looked nervous. Not composed. Not the woman who brought good wine and left before the dishes. Lily answered questions about her zipper scar with the enthusiasm of a tour guide, and I watched my mother's face as she listened, really listened, in a way I didn't remember her listening to me at that age. At one point, Lily climbed into my mother's lap uninvited, the way small children do when they haven't yet learned to be careful with people, and asked her to read a story. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she opened the book, and I understood, watching her, that some walls take a lifetime to build and only a moment to begin cracking. I didn't rush to fill that afternoon with forced warmth. I let it be what it was, awkward in places, tender in others, honest throughout. When my mother left, she hugged me at the door, briefly, stiffly, the way people hug when they're relearning a language they used to speak fluently. "Thank you for letting me come," she said. "Thank you for asking," I answered. And I meant it, though the words still felt strange in my mouth, like a room I was only beginning to move back into. It has been almost a year now since that text arrived in a waiting room that still visits me sometimes, in dreams, in the particular smell of hospital coffee. My relationship with my mother is not repaired in the way movies like to show repair. Not a single tearful scene that resolves everything, not a clean, permanent healing. It is slower than that and more honest. Some weeks she calls and asks real questions. Other weeks the old distance creeps back in, and I let her know, plainly, when it does. Lily is 5 now. Her scar has faded to a thin silver line she barely thinks about, though she still calls it her zipper when she remembers to. She doesn't know the full story of that waiting room, and I don't know if I'll ever tell her all of it. Some truths are mine to carry, so she doesn't have to. What I know now, sitting in my kitchen on a quiet evening with my daughter's laughter drifting in from the next room, is that I never needed revenge. I needed truth, spoken plainly, and the courage to stop performing peace I didn't feel. I think sometimes about the version of me who sat in that waiting room, staring at 5 cruel words on a phone screen, certain that stillness was the only thing left. I wish I could tell her what I know now, that the crack beneath her feet wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of learning which ground was actually solid, and which had only ever looked that way. My daughter's heart was repaired by a surgeon's steady hands. My own took longer. But it healed too, in its own time, in its own quiet way, not because anyone owed me an apology, but because I finally stopped waiting for one to decide how whole I was allowed to be.